Good morning. As Bill said, we will be in Matthew 10, if you want to be turning to that. And we'll talk about some things that are happening before and after that as we get into our lesson today. I had a teacher, and he just had this wonderful expression. He said, because the Word of God is living and active. Remember that passage in Hebrews? Living and active, sharper than a two-edged sword. He said, all living things have structure. And one of the things that he was very helpful with is that each of the gospel writers has a unique way of putting the events in the life of Jesus together. And and I'm in the period of time after Charles Darwin, you know, as science then comes to learn about DNA and RNA, it doesn't matter, and this is the term I like to think about, it doesn't matter if you use a microscope or a telescope, everything in God's creation has order. And so one of the things that's important for us to kind of realize today is that when we come to Matthew 10, we're within a year of the cross. And just kind of let that sink in for a second. When we come to Matthew 10, we're virtually within a year of the crucifixion. And that's one of those things that's kind of hard to tell in terms of text and where we are in a text. And like, for example, of the four Gospels, Matthew is the least chronological. He will do things more thematically than it just happened from beginning to end. And if you're within a year of the crucifixion, then there are going to be things that Jesus is going to teach, but we're especially going to look at things that he wants his disciples and his apostles to do because he's only going to be with them for another year. And so, central idea today, and I'm using one of our terms, excuse me just a second. When I read Matthew 10, the word on-the-job training comes to mind. Apprenticeship. And one of the important spiritual influences in my life, Lyndall Bolin preached in Sayre, I'm guessing from 7th grade through 11th grade. And as we talked through the years, he said, if I had to do it over again, he said, I would have spent more time either as an associate or working in some capacity with someone. And he said, I was in college and preached every weekend, preached for the first church that I could. And he said, I had to learn everything the hard way from my own mistakes. And he said, I think it would have been better if I would have worked with someone and had the opportunity to learn with them and from them rather than just having to learn everything the hard way myself. And so, between freshman and sophomore year, was able to work with a church in Childress, Texas for 2 summers. We came back to Oklahoma Christian, and the church at Nakoma Park let us work with them for a year. And then before we graduated, we had worked with the church at South Walker for 2 years. So I got to have on-the-job training with 4 totally different ministers before I went out and just started working with it myself. And when we read the passage today, the process is very similar in that what Jesus is going to do is, we're going to use this term, he's going to send them out. And we'll look at that and talk about that. So our aim today is to identify the learning curve for the 12 apostles being sent out to the people. And we'll mention this toward the end, but just think about this. I'm thinking of the 4 fishermen mending their nets. And Jesus comes along and he says, you know, come follow me and I will make you what? Fishers of men. there's going to be some parallels of things that they can learn from fishing, but can you think of anything any more different than fishing for fish and fishing for men on the other hand? Can I say it this way? It doesn't take a lot of tact to be a fisher of fish. You just go out and fish. It takes a whole different sense of tact and learning to be a fisher of men. And so whether they were tax collectors or fishermen or whatever else, in this final year before the crucifixion, then Jesus is going to send them out, and we'll look at this. I think there was a real learning curve for them. The very first thing I want you to notice is that within the book of Matthew, there are 5 times where Jesus gives a prolonged lesson, and Matthew organizes these into 5 blocks of teaching. And at the end of each one of these, he will use this expression, when Jesus had finished. And so when we complete the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew's going to say, when Jesus had finished teaching these things. And then when we come to chapter 10, and we're going to send out the 12 today, then we come to 11 verse 1, Jesus had finished instructing his disciples. And that's what we're going to look at today. Jesus is going to be involved in instructing his disciples, but they're not going to be sitting at his feet. Having sat at his feet, he is going to send them out. But the other thing I want you to notice, and this is number 2, in this early part of Matthew, in 4:23, watch what the apostles have been able to see Jesus doing. Matthew tells us he goes throughout all of Galilee, and he's doing 3 things. He's teaching, he's preaching, and he's healing. And then we're going to have the Sermon on the Mount. And in between these 2 blocks of teaching, the Sermon on the Mount and chapter 10, are going to be 10 miracles. And stop and think about the echo, the parallels in the life of Moses and the ministry of Jesus. Moses is going to write the first 5 books. So as Matthew records the ministry of Jesus, he then is going to record 5 major blocks of teaching. How did Moses physically deliver Israel from Egypt? The 10 plagues. So in between the first block of teaching and the second block of teaching, then Matthew is going to mention 10 plagues. And where did God's people come from? They came out of the land of Egypt. Where did Joseph and Mary go to get away from King Herod? To the land of Egypt. And so Jesus is going to come out of Egypt. The Israelites are going to cross the Red Sea. Jesus is going to be in the Jordan River. He's going to be baptized by John in the water of the Jordan River, is going to come out, and then is going to begin his ministry. And Matthew's going to feature that he's involved in teaching, preaching, and healing. And we'll see the same thing in 4:23 and then in 4:35. I want to read a section from Matthew 9, and this is just before we start in chapter 10. Jesus saw the crowds. He had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. There were a couple of occasions where Israel's leader or general is going to be killed, and the people, Scripture's going to say, are scattered upon the hills like sheep without a shepherd. And this is going to be an Old Testament expression for God's people who are in need of leadership. And as Jesus is teaching and preaching and healing, he looks out and sees these multitudes moved with compassion, and the same way that Israel would need a general or a leader because they were sheep without a shepherd, then Jesus is going to provide that same type of spiritual leadership. But he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Pray earnestly to the Lord of harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." And we're going to look at this passage, Lord willing, at a later time this year. I grew up singing a wonderful song, Lord of Harvest, send forth reapers. And this is a prayer that Jesus asked them to pray. But here's what I want you to notice. Very quickly, rather than just hoping and waiting for someone else to do this, what does Jesus do? He sends them out. And I doubt that they would have looked at this and thought, okay, we're the answer to Jesus' prayer, because they still need to pray this. And he just says, lift up your eyes, look into the fields, they are white unto harvest. Pray to the Lord of harvest to send forth workers, laborers into his harvest. And I think that's something that we need to continue to do continually, because in different ways and in different places, the fields are white unto harvest. And what is lacking are the laborers or the workers to be sent out. If you have an outline, you come to number 3. I'm in a class with Brother McCord on the book of Matthew, and as we're going along, he said, in my opinion, Matthew 9:13 is one of the most important verses in the book of Matthew. And Jesus is going to say, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And what is significant about this is that, well, let me finish the verse. I came not to call the righteous, but the unrighteous. And what is significant is that there were things that you couldn't learn even if you were sitting at the feet of Jesus until you went and either did them or learned them for yourself. Can you imagine only trying to learn to ride a bicycle by watching a video? What's going to happen when you finally get on? You know, you have to find that balance and things. And it's usually guys. I see these guys riding around with no handlebars or no hands on it, and they just have that perfect balance. And I'm thinking, I would break my neck. I just, and I've even seen guys turn a corner, and they know just exactly how. Don't even touch the handlebars. They've got that balance down. They probably learned that by falling off a time or two. And to actually learn a new skill, like, for example, catching men, then Jesus is going to say, in this case, about mercy, I want you to go and learn what this means. And this is a quotation from Hosea. God is going to say, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And so in the same way that takes place in chapter 9, when we come to chapter 10, what we're going to have is that these apostles have been watching Jesus teach, they've been watching him preach, they've been watching him heal, and sometimes this is called the limited commission. And now at this point, and then when you realize, okay, we're within a year of the cross, now's the time to send these guys out to let them have this experience, because they're going to come back and to report to Jesus all the things that they've seen and heard. And this learning curve, this apprenticeship, this discipleship is going to intensify, because it's one thing to sit at the feet of Jesus and listen to something. It's a whole different matter to go explain it to someone else yourself. And you stop and think, what kind of responses are they going to get as they go out? Some people are going to be like the 3 monkeys. They don't either want to hear or know anything about it. Some people are going to be eager to learn. Some people will ridicule them, maybe even persecute them. And you just look at all the things that they're going to learn, not only about the message, but the importance of being messengers. And it's one thing to hear something in your head, and then it's another thing to explain it to someone else. And this is why I use this term learning curve. What we're going to have is that in this limited commission, only go to the house of Israel, do not go to the Gentiles. Jesus is going to send them out. And a part of the term I used, he finished instructing his disciples. Well, yes, he is going to teach them words, but an important part of the instructing is also going to be this experience that they're going to have for the first time, going out on their own, because they're going to learn a totally different, and I use the term hands-on, they're going to learn a totally different aspect of the message when they try to explain that to someone else, rather than just sitting and listening and absorbing the things that Jesus said. When you look at this word instructing, then he is going to instruct them verbally before, but they're going to talk about the things after. And instructing is to give someone detailed instructions about what must be done. Nearly close to the word order. Jesus gives them very clear, and we'll look at some of these as we go through, very clear instructions. This is what I want you to do. This is how you're to behave. This is how you're to respond. And he gives them kind of a limited, structured learning curve for the first time. In addition to a study in religious education, I went ahead and certified as a high school social studies teacher, 7 through 12. And after you have finished classwork or somewhere during that, then you get to go do what? Student teaching. And we were in South Oklahoma City, and so I went to Webster, which was just straight west of Crossroads Mall. One of my teachers was fabulous. He was a huge man, Mr. Little, but just this huge, huge man. And as we talked, he said, I thought I always wanted to be a teacher. Very, very young, all through school, went to college. And he said, I started teaching 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And by the end of October, after my first year, I thought, I have made a terrible mistake. I only thought I wanted to be involved in helping people who are pre-humans. and he said, every week from probably the end of September through April, I told my wife, when this contract is over, I'm going to go do something else. I want to work with real people. I don't want to work with juveniles anymore. I just thought I wanted to be a teacher. And then here it came, but he said, the last 3 weeks, I finally could be able to see some hints of human beings in my students. And if you're a junior high teacher or have been in junior high, you know what he's talking about. And he said, but it took the entire year for me to be involved in this process to then understand somebody has to pay the price, and someone has to understand, and someone has to suffer with them, and someone has to work with them to get them from the pre-human to the human state as they're maturing. Well, look at this. All the time growing up, all the time through college, I want to be a teacher, but until he actually gets out and does this, then it's a whole different thing. I had one other teacher for an hour, and the third class period, she says, you've done this before, haven't you? And I said, well, yes, ma'am, I'm in youth ministry and on. I wouldn't have told anybody this, but she said, well, I'll be doing inventory with the vice principal in the material closet. I'll check in with you after school. And so I was there for 6 weeks, and probably for 5 weeks of it, the other teacher wasn't even there. She went and was involved in doing other things during the last hour of school. But going back to the point, as a student teacher, how helpful is it to have someone who's taught for years and to be in his classroom and to work with him and to do that? And that's what's happening here. Rather than waiting until he dies and he's not there for them to visit with, and then they have to be sent out, then in chapter 10, Jesus is going to send them out. And you'll see Matthew 6:30, roughly halfway down. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And in Mark 6:31, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while, for so many were coming and going that they didn't even have the leisure to eat. Matthew's going to give us several other things that are going to happen, but it's very interesting. Both in Mark and in Luke, Jesus sends out the 12. Herod is involved, and he's a very vicious and malicious type character. And then we have the feeding of the 5,000. And you send 12 guys out teaching and preaching, and you end up having 5,000 men who are going to run across the lake with nothing to eat, and they are all excited about making Jesus king. I would have been scared to send these guys out. Their interpretation of the kingdom was very, very different than Jesus was, but it was more important that they had that learning curve and that experience as a part of their preparation and their learning. Number 4, halfway down the first page, I'm not long after Pentecost, so we're really not too far down the road, and the apostles are going to be brought in before the Sanhedrin, and I'm in Acts chapter 5. When you come down to verse 33, when they heard this, they were enraged and wanted to kill them. Now just stop and think for a second. You would never have this experience as a fisherman. Matthew might have had this experience as a tax collector, but most of the apostles had not been in a situation where people were so angry at them that they wanted to kill them. And then we're going to find, and this is number 4 too, when they had called the apostles, Acts 5:40, they beat them, they charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus, and then they let them go. Then they left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. A part of the reality, and I'm thinking about this from Jesus' point of view, a part of the reality of becoming an apostle is that we know what happens to Judas, okay? And other than the Apostle John, as far as we can tell from church history, each of the other 10 apostles died a violent death. Let me say that again. Each of the 10 apostles died a violent death. I see why in the book of Luke, Jesus prays all night before he selects the 12 apostles. When they leave their nets, talking about the fishermen, and they come follow him, they have no idea what that's going to be, who knows, 30 or 40 years later. But to help prepare them for things like being beaten, for being persecuted, and all the things that are going to happen to them, then Jesus gives them these early opportunities to go out and to have some experiences with different things. But I'm sure also one of the things, and this is going to be a part of the discussion, you know, if they don't listen to you, what are you supposed to do? Shake the dust off your feet. And that's going to be a part of the beginning of this learning curve that Jesus gives to them. So here's number 1, 2/3 of the way down. The word apostle is the idea of one who is sent forth. So when you hear the term apostle, then apostle is someone who, and I think oftentimes the word messenger. An apostle is someone that has been sent out. And here's Matthew 10:1. He called to him his 12 disciples. And notice what he's going to do and this is going to be a part of their on-the-job training here. He gave them authority over unclean spirits, to cast them out, and to heal every disease and every affliction. And so here's this limited commission, and as they have watched Jesus teaching, preaching, and healing, then Jesus is going to give them that capacity to do that. And then here's Matthew's list. Simon, who's called Peter, Andrew, his brother, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. So here are brothers in the fishing business. And to me, it's also interesting They obviously have a spiritual tie, but they have a blood tie as well. And these guys are going to be a part of the core of the apostles. Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, and I laugh, Matthew the tax collector. I wonder if the other 11 ever gave him a hard time about his previous occupation as a tax collector. And obviously, he understood some things about persecution that the fishermen didn't know. James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus. Simon the Zealot. And the Zealots are a group of people who believe that the kingdom of God is coming, but it's going to come with the sword. The Zealots were kind of the militia of the Jewish group guerrilla fighters. And their heroes were Joshua and the Maccabees, who fought in the Inner Testament against the Romans. And so we have a tax collector, a zealot, fisherman, and then Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. The most likely identification of the term Iscariot, there is a town in Judea called Iscariot, very close to that. And I wonder, Judas may have been the only apostle who wasn't a Galilean. Do you remember when Peter is at the fire? What does the little girl say to them? You're one of them. What gives you away? Your accent gives you away. Judas probably has access to people in Jerusalem because he doesn't have the hillbilly twang of Galilee. We worked with a church for 3 years in Mississippi, and Sheila taught a girls' class the first time they'd had one. And you can imagine from our Midwestern point of view, when we hear people from the Deep South, we think they're the ones with the accent, right? And they'd say, Miss Sheila, you talk so funny, Miss Sheila. How did you say that? And just over and over and again, we would just have to smile because it was Miss Mary Helen, Betty Ruth, very, very formal in a lot of ways. We had our first child while we were there, and the term was, how is Miss Sheila's condition? Didn't use the word pregnancy, that was too personal. How's Miss Sheila's condition? And it was a wonderful experience, but every time I opened my mouth, I gave myself away. I'm not from Mississippi. And when you look at the apostles, Judas may be the only apostle who's not from Galilee. And this is the group that Jesus called together. So the 12, and you see the term Jesus sends out the 12 apostles. He sent them out instructing. And see, this is the term that's going to be used in Matthew 10. Instructing them, and it's kind of like this time, okay? Go nowhere among the Gentiles, enter no town of the Samaritans, but go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And that's why I said a lot of times I think of this as the limited commission. By the time we come to the end of Matthew, what's Jesus going to say? Now go into all the world, but before we do that, for our apprenticeship, our student teaching, then I want you to go just to the lost sheep of the house of Israel and proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You received without pain, give without pay. And again, we'll encourage you to read chapter 10 very carefully later because there's a number of things we're not going to be able to do. But I want you to think about this from the point of view of, let's start with James and John. What kind of, and what term do I use? Authority, ability, capacity is maybe a better word. What kind of capacity do you have, having been a fisherman, to now be able to cast out demons? Do you see what I'm saying? What an important learning curve this is going to be. You've never had this ability, and Jesus is going to let you cleanse lepers, cast out demons, heal the sick, and raise the dead. Now, here's my concern. And let me say it this way. I had an older preacher tell me, you will never quite know what prayer is like until you have a teenage son who gets his driver's license for the first time. He said, you will understand something about prayer once your teenage son starts to drive that you didn't understand if you had a daughter. Do I hear an amen on this section right here? You know, but you know what I'm saying. We had a young man at Eastside that I wasn't physically scared of him, but he was just a scary guy. And literally the first time I saw him behind the wheel of a car, I went and hid behind a telephone pole. Because I thought, oh no, Brian has a license. And literally, not figuratively, literally, I thought, I don't want to be out here in the parking lot. There's no telling what he's going to do. And I just went and got behind an object and kept it between he and me when I first saw him. Lord, shall we call down fire from heaven? Well, not now, not right now. But do you see what I'm saying? This is, you talk about a learning curve. You give these guys who've never had this ability, who've never had this capacity before, the ability to raise the dead. And it's kind of scary. From my point of view, looking at this as both a parent and a teacher, you're going to give sons of thunder this kind of ability. And what's the term that we use a lot with our kids? With privilege comes what? Good responsibility. Did you ever hear that? With privilege comes responsibility. And so Jesus is giving them this early opportunity to learn to do this because something that's this powerful, they need to learn, can I use the term boundaries? They need to learn the appropriate and proper use of it. So their commission, and here it is, he sends them out, but he says, if you are not received, shake the dust off your feet. Now, that's something that to me is hard to learn. When Sheila and I, we went on 2 campaigns at Belize. It was British Honduras then. And Sheila had done campaigns through high school and was way ahead of me. And we were studying with a man, and after the second time we'd explained some stuff, we were going back to where we were staying, and Sheila said, I think it's time to shake the dust off her feet. And I said, well, I really would like to explain one more time. She said, we're here for 3 weeks. If he doesn't want to listen to the gospel, Jesus said there's a judgment call. When do you shake the dust off your feet? When do you say, I don't think you have the willingness to listen right now? And it's not only just a waste of time, I don't think of it as a waste of time, but is it maybe a better use of time to go to someone who may be willing and able to hear, that we don't get to the next person if we don't shake the dust off our feet? Her name is now Prissy Sellers. We knew her as Prissy Walk in those days. She said something very instructive to us. She said, one of the things I've learned on campaigns is that, and we had people who had taken Bible correspondence courses, and we go over this town of 40,000 people. It was a triangle of 40,000 people. And she said, while you're going to someone else's house, God may introduce you to someone on the way that was the real reason he had sent you to that person's house in the first place. And she said, don't have such tunnel vision that you're only just going to this next person, because God may bring someone into your acquaintance, coming and going, that he has been working with that you don't know anything about. And so again, here the apostles are sent out for the first time. On the back page, and let's walk through these first ones quickly, discussions about persecution. And the same way that they're going to have to learn to deal with these gifts that Jesus is going to give to them, there's a learning curve to learn how to deal with different people's perceptions. As we have interns, and I talk with them, I said, there's a big difference between our personal lives, and I'm just going to use the term our professional life, talking about in ministry, And the very first guy that I worked with, prince of a guy, he said, son, when you get ready to leave a church and you make the announcement, some people are going to clap and some people are going to cry. He said, some people are going to say, there is a God in heaven. Yes. And then some people are going to cry. And he said, if you can't deal with the fact that regardless of what you do, some people are going to like it and some people aren't, he said, don't get into ministry. So, obviously, I've had a little bit of experience at that. At 3 different times, I've had someone come out and say, I think you're absolutely the worst preacher I have ever heard in my life. And I compliment them on their perceptive ability. Not everyone is as perceptive as you are. Well, I have a fight with them. I'm not going to change their mind. If that's how they feel, that's no skin off my nose, because who am I actually trying to serve? And even as humans trying to serve him, we're not going to make everyone happy all the time. And that's what they're going to have to learn, because their opposition is very quickly going to come to people trying to kill them, not just, I don't like you. And so Jesus says, I'm sending you like sheep among wolves. And I just kind of shudder every time I read that, because the sheep are the victims. They're not going to stand a chance against wolves. But this is one of my favorite expressions in Matthew 10, and you think, how appropriate for all of us. I want you to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Isn't that an interesting contrast between two opposites? Be thoughtful, be subtle, be wise in how you deal with things, but also at the same time, be harmless as doves. Be on your guard. They will flog you. They will arrest you. You will be given what to say on that day. All men will hate you because of me, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. This next one is, do not fear him who can kill the body. Fear him who can kill the body and the soul. And again, this is something for them to learn. And let me just say it this way. They're to have a greater fear, and I'm using that in terms of respect, of God than they are of men, in any different capacity. And then if you confess me before men, I will confess you before my Father who's in heaven. And I think that's such a wonderful promise, both for apostles and also for us. And then here comes, and this would be very hard initially, I didn't come to bring peace but a sword. And I think what Jesus is saying is that if, and sometimes when, it comes to either being pleasing to my family or being pleasing to God, then I must make the decision to be pleasing to God. And he goes through a whole list of relationships, mother and father, brother and sister, and goes through all of this. And something very significant, though, happens. He talks about taking up your cross and following me. And this is very important. We're a year before the death of Jesus, and this is the first time the word cross is used. And I can see the apostles just thinking, what is he talking about? And as much as they've misunderstood the kingdom, this would be something that they wouldn't really understand at all. And then he says, we find by losing, we lose our lives for the gospel, and we will find it. Then as you go out, if anyone receives you as a righteous man, they will receive a righteous man's reward. And then I love this little passage, whoever gives even a cup of cold water in my name shall not lose his reward. And what's really important in that is that there is nothing insignificant that you and I do for God. You'll continue to hear me mention this at different times. Howard Norton said once, he said, none of us will ever know the most important thing we do for God. Something that to us may not have been very important, might not have been very significant, God may use to do something we could never have thought about. And Jesus says, even if you give a cup of cold water in my name, you will not lose your reward. So let's look at these bottom things and we're done. As I said, Jesus doesn't mention the cross until Matthew 10. We're very close to the end, and they're thinking of an earthly kingdom, and Jesus is going to talk about deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And Jesus is going to give them, and this is under number 2, this apprenticeship of going out and learning by teaching and also the different reception that they're going to have. But I want to read a paragraph to you, and this is the second one from the bottom. And I'm looking at this from kind of from a teacher and a parent's point of view. The apostles had endless arguments about who was the greatest, who would sit at the right and the left hand. They were preventing people from doing a mighty work in the name of Jesus. They rebuked people for bringing the little children to Jesus. James and John wanted to call down fire from heaven. Peter is willing to cut off Malchus's right ear and denies Jesus with an oath. These are probably not the best tactics for fishers of men to win hearts for God. And these guys had some rough edges. But one of our teachers was a former Marine, and he said, you know, talking about Peter, he said, we sometimes are down on Peter, but he said, I would much rather redirect passion and purpose than try to produce it in someone who didn't have any at all. And that's a part of why Peter is chosen. So here's the final paragraph. There were a lot of things the apostles and us today could never learn by sitting at the feet of Jesus. There is a lot to learn when we talk to someone else, verbalize, and I always feel like the teacher probably learns more than anyone else just through the study that goes into a class. And we all need to learn to present the good news in such a way that's glad tidings. And we need to learn as we present the gospel, whether it's by word or by life, that if and when we're persecuted, 1, that's what happened to Jesus. 2, that's what happened to the apostles. And this whole section closes by saying, when Jesus had finished instructing the 12. And a big part of instructing is, yes, we come together, we study, we worship, but the learning curve happens when we go back out into the world. And my prayer is that as we go out, we will be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. God bless.